is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. This is another one that we've talked around a whole lot and never actually covered, Stu Horvath.
Hi.
Wasn't really a joke. It was more of a statement of fact.
It's true.
Because today we're actually going to talk about deities and demigods. Now, I know this has come up several times over the 3 years that we've done this show, to the point where you're like, did we do it? And I was like, I don't know, did we? And we're checking Libsyn and trying to make sure we didn't, and we actually didn't. So today we're going to actually finally getting around to talking about deities and demigods.
I feel like we did this once before when I said, did we do Fiend Folio? And it was just like, oh, let's check all the backlog.
Yeah, I mean, it's so weird because at this point, 3 years into the show, 120-something episodes, give or take, there's a lot of subjects that we cover that have one foot in the door of another book that has a foot in the door in another book, and so on and so forth. So we've definitely touched the base a lot, and we've definitely alluded to it, and we've definitely talked about aspects of it. We never actually talked about deities and demigods.
Yeah, I just love the fact that if we knew what we were doing, we would have front loaded this one because it feels like an audience builder, right? Like everybody knows this book and the weird story behind it, kind of, which is one of the reasons I want to bring it up, because everybody thinks they know the story. And whenever somebody talks about it, I'm just like, no, you got it wrong. It came up in our Discord today. That's why I wanted to talk about it, because I got to go on record.
Yeah, I mean, it's time. It is finally time. So Stu, why don't you tell our listeners about deities and demigods?
So Deities and Demigods is the fourth Advanced Dungeons and Dragons rule book to come out. It comes out right after Dungeon Master's Guide. That gives you an idea of the importance of this book from TSR's perspective. It's the fourth one right after the core. It comes out in 1980, and it's a collection of gods, heroes, and other aspects of mythology designed to give you the tools and the examples for you to create your own mythology. I guess that the idea was sort of you could use these gods, but they really, back in the early days, they were very concerned with folks making their own stuff. And this was a sort of leading by example, show and tell. These are some real world mythologies. These are famous fictional mythologies. And here's examples of the in-house made up gods for the monsters of Dungeons and Dragons. Now you go do it. In execution, I feel like Deities and Demigods, it was also, the hope was that by showing stats for gods, it would make players sort of calm down with their power fantasies and getting characters up to 40th level and getting all the magic items and this, that, and the other thing. When in fact, because the gods have what amounts to deity stats, which are not all that dissimilar from monster stats, is that players are going to want to kill them and take their stuff because that's what you do in D&D.
I mean, if it has stats, theoretically, you should be able to kill it.
If it's got the hit points, you should be able to kill it. I agree. It's like a mechanical truth.
Yeah, there's numbers. There's numbers that you can subtract from, and if you could subtract from a hit point total, things should be able to die.
And that's exactly what the book reads like. Like you look through it and you see these gods and you see their awesome toys and you want to take them. They got chariots that fly through the sky and, shoot fire. And they have crazy magic wands and swords and tridents and all this stuff. And you just want to have those toys so that you can play with them. And there you go.
I mean, isn't that the core tenet of Dungeons and Dragons? We've come to steal your shit.
Yep, totally. And that's basically what happens. It just adds a layer to it and eventually gets embraced by D&D actual because, you go to the Demon Web Pits in the first adventure sequence to take it to Lolth and steal her stuff.
Yeah.
So eventually this idea that there was a propriety to knowing your place as a player and having characters that tap out after 20th level. I mean, all Demon Web Pit says is that yes, you can kill gods, but you could do it at 14th level, I think is what that module's rated at.
Yeah, it kind of falls apart after that. So just try to keep it under 14.
Yeah. But all of this is sort of second to two other things that are, really key components of the popularity of Deities and Demigods. The first is the art. It's Errol Otis's first cover art for Dungeons and Dragons. It's fantastic. It has his trademark bright colors and a little bit of psychedelic vibe I've always felt Otis has. I've always felt that, and not always because I didn't have context for RuneQuest for a long time, but once I got into RuneQuest and the way that the mythology of RuneQuest interacts with the world, I feel like Errol Otis's cover for Deities and Demigods is a really good representation of that and a really poor representation of how it works in Dungeons and Dragons.
That's a fair point.
Yeah, because you have these two guys who are just like, they're guys. They're obviously opposed. One's in a temple, and they're fighting, but through their power of their fight, their gods are also in the sky fighting too. And that's very Glorantha. And the interior art is pretty great too. Jeff Dees does some fantastic work. I absolutely love his Egyptian pantheon art. He does a lot of the monster deities too. They're just like crisp, clean. He was a young kid when he was doing this, but brought a really kind of professional comic book artist's draftsman skills to the book. It really brings a new level of professionalism to the D&D publishing oeuvre,
Lots of 25-cent words too. I love it.
I don't know if I pronounced it right. I definitely pronounced it so it sounds French, but I don't know if it sounds correct French. I'm sure
okay.
somebody will correct me.
You'll definitely hear about it in the chat.
I know how to spell that word.
It's more than I can say about my spellings of the word omelet, but go on.
But as much as the art is important, and I think that it is important for a lot of people, it's the fact that two of the pantheons that were originally included in the book were cut out is probably the thing that most people find fascinating about this book.
Controversy.
Those two pantheons are H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos and Michael Moorcock's Elric characters from those stories. This is sort of interesting to me because I remember back, when I first started getting into Dungeons and Dragons, I remember people being like, something happened with this book.
Yeah.
And it was like the 80s. So like, where did you hear this from? The internet? No, that didn't exist yet. I don't know where this word of mouth came from, but I knew that there were two pantheons and they were taken out. They were taken away, Hambone, by somebody. You have the Satanic Panic stuff is going on around the same times. There's a swirl of sort of sinister implications, right? Ooh, maybe TSR finally went too far,
Oh, no.
Maybe those kooky Satanic Panic people, they finally got him and made him take something out, which doesn't make any sense because there's plenty of boobs in the book, even after they took the two other pantheons out. So if it was anything involving Christian fundamentalists winning a victory over TSR, you could be sure that there would be no bare breasts in the book once they were done with it. But then new information comes out a little bit later. For me personally, like I don't know how anybody knows any of this in the 80s. Like, was it in Dragon Magazine in the letters columns? Was it all discovered after the fact, in exit interviews or whatever? I don't know. All I know is when I was growing up, the first thing was like, ooh, Satanic Panic, spooky, something bad happened. And then I found out that there was a company called Chaosium and that either Chaosium stole the Cthulhu mythos and Elric for themselves, or they had the rights and TSR stole the Cthulhu mythos and Elric for themselves. And D&D folks are always going to be like, yeah, screw Chaosium. They ruined a perfectly cool book. And then the Chaosium stands are going to be like, no, TSR was always evil. They sue regularly, blah, blah, blah. And all of these things sort of combine into like this low-level static that whenever somebody comes up and talks about deities and demigods, they think something along these lines, that there was something bad, the lawsuits were involved, the original editions were pulped and it was recalled, and all of that is 100% not true.
Wow. So you mean all the people who've been fantasy booking this since 1980 and are reading it on the equivalent of the dirt sheets for Dungeons and Dragons are wrong?
You're 100% on the money, Hambone.
Well, tell me more. And the listeners want to know too.
Yeah, it really just comes down to a string of screw-ups, which makes sense because nobody knew what they were doing in 1980. It was still a hobbyist industry. No matter how much money D&D and TSR were raking in it was still a tiny group of people who were kind of role-playing, being professional role-playing designers. There were no real rules. While TSR had the money to sort of put out a product that seemed professional, they were still kind of like making stuff up as they go along, and probably doubly so for Chaosium at that point, which didn't have a huge amount of like high profile, high production value games out in 1979 when this book was under development. So what happens is that when James Ed Ward starts working on Deities and Demigods, he wants to put in these fictional pantheons. He's got Fritz Lieber's Lankmar in there, he's got Elric, and he's got the Cthulhu mythos. And he goes and gets permission for all three. Fritz Lieber's easy. It's a phone call because Gary Gygax and Lieber are friends. Fritz says, sure, go nuts. Same thing basically happens with Elric. Ward gets Moorcock's phone number, makes his case. Moorcock's like, sure, use it. That'll be fun. The Cthulhu Mythos rights are really weird, which is like a whole different hour-long conversation. Basically, Arkham House gives Ward the rights to use the Cthulhu Mythos stuff in their game book. Whether or not Arkham House had the rights to give them that right is really a matter of debate. Lovecraft stuff is probably in the public domain at that point. Doesn't matter. They did the needful. They dotted their I's and crossed their T's, and they were good to go. The problem is Chaosium did the same thing. And they might have done it earlier too. That I'm not 100% sure of, but the Elric stuff is an understandable mess up where Ward went to Michael Moorcock directly. Chaosium went to his agent who signed off on it. So they also had a legitimate usage of the rights, and they had permission from Arkham House. It seems like Arkham House misunderstood how those rights would be handled, like as IP law, because like Arkham House is a small publisher too. It wasn't even August Derleth anymore. It was his daughter. So she kind of inherited it, and she wasn't in publishing. So these kind of things, this is this sort of understandable mess ups, right? And sort of a cascade of them. The only way that Chaosium and TSR could make this right legally, to get satisfaction legally, it wasn't suing each other because they both did the right thing. It would be to sue the people that issued too many rights. So they would have had to file suit against Michael Moorcock and Arkham House Books. And nobody wanted to do that because that's a really jerky thing to do. That nobody would have been happy then.
Yeah.
So they came to an agreement. The first printing of Deities and Demigods has everything that TSR wanted in there, all three pantheons plus the mythological stuff from the real world. The second one, after this comes to light and they talk about it, has all of that too, plus a thank you to Chaosium for like, hey, thanks for being cool about this little snafu. So right there, that undercuts any scenarios where there's dark deeds or anything. There's literally a thank you. Brian Bloom apparently had a problem with this. There's all sorts of theories why. Part of it might be the Satanic Panic. Part of it might just be like he doesn't want another game company's name in the credits, which is understandable and also silly because like they're not going to lose business. You know, like that was silly if that was the case. So he pulls the content, drops Elric, drops the Cthulhu Mythos. For several printings later, though, nobody thinks to remove the thank you to Chaosium. So it stays in there, I think, until the fifth printing, which is just like pure TSR, like not quite as professional as you think. You know, with the orange spines, they just reprinted the whole thing as it was. And like they didn't even change the copyright dates. So that's why like in the secondary market now, people asking, you know, original edition prices because it still has the same copyright date, even though they came out in 84, you know? So like there's all sorts of stuff like that TSR did. What Chaosium gets out of this is Thieves World. They get to include these stats for, we talked about that in a previous podcast, where they get like the super group together of everybody who's making role-playing games, and they stat out the Thieves World characters for every system, and then they sell a box set. That's how they got Dave Arneson and Lawrence Schick to write the stats for both flavors of D&D for that box set as a mea culpa for this whole screw up. The best part about this is that it happens again a couple years later.
But how?
So Thieves World is a huge hit. People were psyched for that book because it was like such like a moment of like, we are the world unity in the role-playing game industry. And So Stafford wants to do it again. And this time he wants to do it with Lankhmar, Fritz Lieber's Lankhmar, the great Fafhrd of the Grey Mouser stories. So he gets Fritz Lieber's permission to do it. Meanwhile, Fritz Lieber had also sold the rights to Gary Gygax to develop a setting for D&D called Lankhmar, City of Thieves. And this time TSR was just like, no, if you want to do this, we're going to sue Fritz. Because at this point, TSR were assholes.
Clearly.
So Stafford was just like, no, forget it. Let it be. You'll make Fritz more money in the long run. And they did. And he lived comfortably because of that deal. I love the fact that it all comes full circle. They go the distance with the original thing. And then it happens again 2 years later. Like, what? How?
Well, man, my big takeaways from this, I've got a few. First, the 4 most dreadful words an agent or like a person who's representing a client could hear is, oh, do you want to do that? Sure. It'll be fun. Never works out good for anybody, right? So the whole Moorcock thing to me is just baffling because, I remember back in the day coming up in the music scene and you kind of know bigger bands and you just want to be like, hey, well, can you guys help us out? And the band wants to help you, but they can't because of certain obligations. And they know if they bring it back to their agent, their manager, whomever's in charge, it's going to get shut down in a big way. And then it's going to be kind of embarrassing when they have to come back and tell you like, sorry, we can't do that. In a situation like this, it's kind of like, yeah, sure, it'll be fun. This is probably like the last time where you could get away with sure, it'll be fun. Because at this point, we always talk about the Old West. This was truly the Old West where it's kind of like, oh, wait, you guys got the date with them? We got the date with them too. Oh, well, all right. It's not a big deal. Fine. Like everyone is courting each other to do the thing that they want to do and not being super litigious about it. And I think that's kind of pretty cool. At the same time, this whole conversation explains a lot because I've had 3 versions of Deities and Demigods. One of them was one of the later versions where none of this stuff was in it. That was like the first version I got, which also in hindsight, I can't imagine any of these dudes back in the day would have ever expected eBay to be a thing, and the aftermarket and stuff like that. And then I had 2 other versions of Deities and Demigods. I had a like legit second printing with all the stuff in it. And then I had a later printing where it still thanks Chaosium, but none of the stuff that would be pertinent to that. And actually, that was the first time I'd ever heard of Chaosium. And I was like, well, what is Chaosium? But I don't see anything that has to do with Chaosium in this book. So it's always been very confusing to me. Now it explains everything. Like I just thought it was like, okay, you got the one version with everything, you got a version without it. But what's this weird one in the middle that kind of alludes to it? I liken it to the scene in the end of Goonies where they're like, oh man, and there was the octopus. And everyone was like,
what?
What octopus? And apparently that one time there was an octopus, and that octopus was Cthulhu.
Yeah. The other thing that is kind of wild is that a lot of these stories have fueled and made this idea persist that there was a recall or that these books were somehow destroyed or pulped or that they're scarce. That's not the case. Deities and Demigods had a print run commensurate with anything else that TSR was putting out at that point. Like there's tens of thousands of copies of these ones that have Cthulhu and Elric in them. And because the story is so persistent amongst people who know, it's one of the top, urban myths of role-playing, I guess. It's just like that Cthulhu was in Dungeons and Dragons at all is kind of like an interesting story. But while they should be somewhat, rare in terms of price and, because people want them, they're not actually rare. There are far more actually rare vintage Dungeons and Dragons books than Deities and Demigods with the Cthulhu mythos in them.
Oh, definitely. And, back in the day, I had heard the pulped stories. I'm like, oh, they ended up in a landfill. And let me tell you, the only 2 things that ever ended up in the landfill were mobsters that wore out their welcome in both Las Vegas and New Jersey and copies of the Atari ET video game.
It's true.
These books are on shelves in houses somewhere, and you could probably find them at a flea market or at your local gaming convention because people are trying to sell the stuff.
Yeah, don't get gouged on these, man. I see them going for hundreds of dollars. That's crazy. I bought mine for like 60 something when I first got mine. I mean, granted, that's like 15 years ago, but like, come on, how much is it really worth?
I got mine at the Wayne Toy Show, and I got 2 of them at the same time because one was the one with the Cthulhu mythos in it, and the other didn't have the Cthulhu mythos in it, didn't have Elric, and it didn't have any of that stuff. And it was one of like the latter ones. And the guy was like, yo, $60. And I was like, nah, man, it's too high. He's like, what do you got? I was like, I'll do 40. He's like, tell you what, if you do 50, I'll give you both because I'm definitely not going to be able to move this other one. And I was like, all right, cool. So that's how I got like 2 to 3 copies that I had.
There you go.
And they were in good shape too. Shockingly good shape for books that age. No name inside there though, which I thought was also very impressive because I would have written my name in there in the 80s.
Weirdly, I only have the first 2. I have the one with everything and then the one with everything and the Chaosium, thank you. But I don't have the other 2 flavors, one with nothing but the Chaosium, thank you, and then one with nothing. You'd think I'd have those, but I don't.
Oh, there's always room on the shelf for more.
No, there isn't, Hambone. I can't. Come on. Like, I'm totally okay with only having 2 copies of Deities and Demigods. 2 is excessive, to be honest.
You make a fair point. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on Deities and Demigods?
I like Deities and Demigods better than the other name Legends and Lore.
Oh, yeah.
They issued it under when they changed to the orange spine is Legends and Lore. Because they did at that point want to get sort of away from the Deities and Demigods of it. They felt that was sort of like a red flag for the religious folks and the Satanic Panic. So there was a little bit of that in the mix.
But that's later.
It was years later.
You got to fly in under the radar sometimes, everybody. Put the top up on the Camaro and just cruise with the music down low. You'll get by. So this was another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG. I've already posted about Deities and Demigods, and actually kind of ran all this down. So you could go back to that and Thieves World entry and check my math. Make sure I did it all right again.
And if not, I'm sure we'll hear about it.
I'm sure.
You can find me on Instagram and on Twitter at John McGuire RPG. I'm going to post more. I've got to post more. The book is almost ready to go out to the masses. By the time you hear this episode, if you started Rocket to Russia, it's in the mail and it's on the way to you, and I'm very excited about that. So check me out on Instagram and on Twitter at John McGuire RPG. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. And if you really like the show, why not become a patron? Patreon.com/vintagerepg. We've got a killer Discord community with a special community just for the patrons. We've also got early release episodes. We've got a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book, still tentatively titled Experience Points. We've got a look at My RPG, 3-2-1 Action presents Rocket to Russia, and whatever is coming next for that. We got some cool things and updates for that as well. Patreon.com/vintagerepg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dego West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.